control units that we excavated, and then also from during the monitoring effort. We've run the dates now. We have 25 AMS dates, and for a minute, let me introduce Vince Salcido from the Welcome Watchful tribe of Vineyard Valley.
I just want to thank you all for coming out, and it's been a pleasure working with John because he takes the time to educate all that are involved, as well as us and the people that are in this room. There's something that we believe in as a tribe, is that community, unity, and character for all to all get together and use this for educational purposes. John and I are working on an education kit so that we can start going around to schools and showing and educating kids in the communities about our tribe. Thank you.
I'm not going to introduce Scott Gerald and the tribal chairman who's here because it was going to take away Vince's thunder, so I was told not to. But anyway, we've been working with the tribe over the last, I think I started this project in 2004, had a lot more hair and a few less pounds. But anyway, that's the way life goes. So we're in the final stages now of the report write-up. We've come to some of our major conclusions. We're just refining things now. So when Robin approached us about giving an update, we thought, heck, it's time. They haven't heard from us in a while, so we'll show up and see what happens. First slide. So, as you may know, in a bureaucratic process, there's a lot of agencies that are involved. For this project, we had the City of St. Helena, the State Water Resources Board, who contributed some of the funding, the Army Corps of Engineers, who had oversight over the permitting, the State Office of Historic Preservation. They had to approve everything, all the documents that we generated from this project. The Native American Heritage Commission, and there was peer review comments as well. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about the river. And I've noticed I'm working on a couple other projects in Napa County that are restorations. And a couple of things that first top picture up there is an 1880s picture, or painting, of the Napa River. And you can actually see quite a mosaic of ecotones. Oak, savanna, marsh, wet meadows, vernal pools. So the Napa Valley was one of the richest areas in California in terms of its biota and floral and faunal stuff. And today in the valley you still see a lot of remnants of it. The great valley oaks that are still around. It's one of the few lawn counties or volcanic counties in California, but it's still fairly rural, given the development and everything. One thing about the river is that, and we found this in our excavation, I'll show you a couple slides of that, is that the river was not the incised channel that it is now. You go down and look at the Napa River, there's steep banks with undercutting, things like that. But it was more a series of what we call braided channels. More like what they built for the flood control project, so that when it did flood, it would flow out into these little swales and braided channels. And in fact, Sulphur Creek used to be a braided channel until 1942, when it was straightened, and now all that water comes down, it doesn't flow out, it flows now into the Napa River, and it's all the flooding at the confluence of Sulphur Creek and the Vineyard Valley Mobile Home Park. So with the braided channels, you get more of a dispersed water flow. So with the meandering river, what you do is you get remnants of old landforms, but you're essentially living on an alluvial floodplain. And we actually saw that in the different strata at a couple of the sites that we excavated for our project. But I do want to say my apologies to Vince and Scott, because this is Kroger's map, not yours. But the ethnographic WAPO held the territory all the way from Napa up into Clear Lake. St. Helena is about right in here. So it was kind of what they call a central Walkover area. Now, as far as linguistics goes, the Walkover have the biggest time depth in California in terms of their language. They're what they call a Neo-Aztecan language, related to the Yuki tribes to the north and Vineyard Valley and stuff, and some of the southern California tribes. So they do have quite a bit of time distance, length in terms of their linguistic affiliations in California. Next slide. And that's, a lot of people thought, the Napa Valley was actually settled later in time as the Santa Clara Valley in Southern California. The mission San Francisco was established in 1776. It didn't really affect Napa Valley as it did like Sonoma or the San Francisco area or even around Mission San Jose. But the 1820s is when it really changed with the establishment of the mission at Sonoma. And then with the desecularization in 1834, the missions were large land grants were given to some of the wealthier Mexican Americans at the time. But there still were, this is a rancheria on the west side of the Russian River, south of Jintown Bridge. This was taken in July 1927. And this is another, the same rancheria with a house and sunshade on the left and stuff. So there, when Kroeber and the folks from Berkeley started sending out all these people to do ethnographies, get different. You've already said anybody's going to fall.
Yeah, he's
He's going to fall. So when they started doing their early ethnographies and stuff, they captured that, the Walk of the Mishwal was still very much alive. So that's all I'm going to say about them because, we've written a history, and I'm sure there's 2 voices, 3 voices in different histories. The other thing about working with them on this project is they were very much involved in the public outreach aspect of it. So when we were doing the excavations, we had Santa Rosa JC, we had Cloverdale High School, Montessori schools, the local high school here. We had some seniors come out to do public service. Although Friday nights, Saturday mornings after a football game were probably not the best time to stand at the screening all day. But anyway, so there was a lot of public outreach involving both the archaeologists, the city, and the tribe. Next slide. So the key features of the area, I'm sure everybody knows where the Vineyard Valley Mobile Home Park is, but it's along the Napa River. There's Silver Creek that flows in to the Napa River right here. And then we also have to talk about Napa Glass Mountain up here. Now I think there's a Big Bed and Breakfast up there. But Napa Glass Mountain is an obsidian flow. And it's one of the 4 obsidian flows here in Northern California. You have Napa Glass Mountain, Borax Lake, which is in Clear Lake County. You have Annandale, which is in Sonoma County. And then you have one more, which will come to me in a minute. Mount Kanaka, which is in Clear Lake County. Napa Glass Mountain obsidian was traded all over California, essentially. You don't get that much on the east slope of the Sierra, but some a little bit on the west side. You see as far down as Big Sur, Monterey area. And you'll see, we have some examples here of the Napa. It's a volcanic glass. And it's great for tool making. So we're only about a mile away from the Napa Glass Mountain source, which has a lot of implications as to what we found at the site. Next slide. So prior to, never mind. So prior to construction, before they went to construction, there was a whole series of things that had to happen. And one was we had to turn the National Register of Historic Places eligibility of these sites. And there's a thing called the National Register of Historic Places. It's kept by the keeper of the National Register. So think of Downton Abbey, somebody in a castle. But anyway, so we have this keeper, and what you do is you submit and say, hey, this site is pretty fantastic for these reasons. And that affords it some protection. Next slide. little bouncy thing. It's like Mitch Miller. Anyway, then we had to consult with Native Americans, which is the Walkover tribe. Then we had to consult with the agency. So there was a course of action for this project that started at the beginning. Next slide. So we had what we call the data recovery phase. And that's what I kind of reported on a little bit 5 years ago, but that was just one part of it. So there was actually 3 sites that we did data recovery at. This is what the vineyard next to the mobile home parks in the foreground, way in the back. This is what the vineyard used to look like. And we had kind of a focus on the geoarchaeology of the Napa Valley. You know, how much did the river change? What were the implications for people living along the river? Can we see that in the archaeological record? And then because of its close proximity to the Napa Glass Mountain source, we wanted to focus on Obsidian source or some of the trade through time. What kinds of artifacts made out of Napa Glass Mountain are we finding at the site? Are we finding things that indicate that they were doing primary manufacture there, that they were exporting these things? Things I'll answer in a few minutes. Next. So one of the biggest things, I don't know how many of you have taken a walk out there. I haven't been out there since they did the restoration, but there was quite a bit of mass excavation. And you can see this is where the backhoe driver is. That's where the Vineyard Valley home used to be. They took that down about 7 to 8 feet, and then in the basin where the vineyard used to be, they created these swells, and there's water pumps in there and stuff like that, so that when the water floods over, it moves, it's slower, it's more dispersed. We monitored this mass excavation. So there was a lot of things that were just picked up by when they were doing the monitoring. Next slide. We also removed features found during mass excavation. Here we are working on a feature, and you can see we're probably about 6.5, 7 feet down. This is still at the end of the Vineyard Valley Mobile Home Park, and you can see how deep we went and where we found things. And then the layers above it, we actually carefully drew them out, and we came up with this stratigraphic sequence. This operation, I think, was frustrating for some of the residents of the Vineyard Valley Mobile Home Park, in that, you know, they wanted to get the construction going and stuff like that, and we just kept finding stuff. During 2 phases of excavation, the first phase we didn't find any human remains. The second phase we found 4, and then they removed some of the buildings and redwood trees, and that's where a lot of the stuff came from. Next slide. So you can see we tried to excavate things in 10 centimeter blocks. That this sidewall profile over here, and I won't read what it says, but you can see the different strata that we came up with as we went down. Here, there was 3 feet of fill that was laid over for the Vineyard Valley home for their grading pads. And then below that, there was natural soil. And then different layers, mainly containing obsidian flakes, a little gravel layer, a flood layer, and interspersed with some bedded sands, which indicate that there was quite a bit of flooding. We didn't find any house floors or other features that gave us an indication that it was kind of semi-permanently occupied. I wouldn't say it was. They probably had to move away certain times of the year, primarily because of the flooding and stuff, which we did see in the profiles. Next slide. So, besides having fun up in Napa, we came up with research questions, and it's articulated in a fairly thorough research design that we submitted. So the first question that a lot of archaeologists ask is cultural chronology. How old? What happened over time? Can we place this in a time frame? And doing that, we use a lot of dating techniques. And I use the example of, say, neckties. I mean, everybody here at one point, well, maybe not anymore, but has worn a necktie. A necktie, the style has changed. The width has changed, the thickness, the colors, design, the patterns, orientation, and artifacts are like that. You have the same form, but something may trigger a change to make it a little bit different. This is the same with Levi's. Levi's have changed from when I was growing up in the 1880s. We just had a pair of canvas Levi's. Now you can go to Macy's and get like 50 different kinds. I can get ones with sparklies on my butt. I get ones with little slits in the side. That's a good example of how things change through time. And a lot of times it can be documented. So that was one of our questions. Another was looking at economic patterns. Technology, how are they making things? We're going to find the tools that they made, the tools that were used in like making projectile points, arrowheads, or things like that. And exotic items. So there's certain items that, like the olive shell beads, they don't occur here in Napa Valley. They're from the coast. They were probably brought in, but trying to get to the mechanisms of how they were brought in. And then settlement patterns, where did they live? And I'll show you further on, there was a series of sites all over that plain. They just weren't at, the mobile Vineyard Valley site, which stuff. And then we're looking at demography, and because we did find a cemetery, we're looking at sort of like the biology of that population that was there. Social organization, how they organize. We'll be able to get to that. And in some instances you can, when you look at how many males and females, how many juveniles you have, things like that. And then trade and exchange. Where do they get those exotic materials? Next slide. So just a little bit about chronology. Starting in the 1930s, the University of California in Berkeley, actually in association with the junior college in Sacramento, started working on chronology. And they noticed that artifacts tended to be with certain types. And they were able, it was mainly through burial seriation or looking at the different artifacts and burials, that they came up with the different time periods. So, anyway, for the San Francisco Bay, we have Augustine pattern. Well, what does Augustine mean? Well, it's just certain kinds of artifacts. But the type site is actually Emeryville. So I don't know if you guys go shopping at the Emeryville shops. It's up near IKEA. Well, there was a big site there. There was actually a mound that was over 26 feet high at one point. Then you have Upper Berkeley, Ellis Landing, Lower Berkeley. But you'll notice that in the Bay Area, 3000 to 500 BC, there's not too many sites that are like older than that. Then we have the St. Helena aspect, which is in Napa Valley, way over on the left-hand side. And you see that it has, affinities to the Bay Area in terms of some of the projectile points, which you guys are going to see. And then you have Berkeley pattern and Mendocino. So what you're doing is getting a mixture of the north, the Mendocino pattern. The archaeologists are very complicated. And these are kind of like geographic terms. So it's hard for us to remember. So if I remember Mendocino, I know that's north. Berkeley is south. So anyway, in Napa Valley we have kind of a mixing of both patterns. And that's by artifact types. Now, we rarely, I don't know one site older than 5,000 years in the Napa Valley, but up in Clear Lake County, at the Borax Lake site, that site's been dead 10,000 years old. Next slide. So that was just a little bit about chronology. And you're not going to be quizzed on this, but we kind of talked about upper emergent, lower emergent, upper archaic, middle archaic. So what I've done here, this was a whole series of sites that we actually tested for the flood control project. So you see the latest site is the site in red up there. Then the next latest site dating to about AD 900, about 1600 or so, are the ones in the yellows. And then the next one, which would be the 600 BC to about AD 900, are the ones in green. And then the blue would be some of the oldest sites, which would be like 3000 BC to about 600, and there was actually only one of those sites out there. So you can see just within that small area, you get a convergence of different dates. And those sites were probably occupied at different times. And to date those sites, we primarily used obsidian hydration dating, and we didn't have the fine-tunedness that we actually do with the sites now. Next slide. So, some of the finds. We found lithics. Like I said, we're scientists, so we don't say we found rocks. We have to say we found lithics. So they're basically, lithics are the stone tools. Brownstone, so like mortars and pestles. Same thing if you go down to Strata today and you get a pestle, a nice little granite pestle to do your garlic for your Napa, for dipping into olive oil from the St. Leo Olive Oil Company. Your mortars are about the same thing. Osteology. So we had 162 sets of human remains, and that was from one site only. Funnel bone, instead of saying, we found bones, we distinguish it. Funnel bone is, it could be a meat, it could be something that they exploit, like deer, elk, or something like that. Or it could be something that kind of gets into the ground, like a ground squirrel. So we found a lot of that. On the left, you see a picture of a big ash hearth. It contained seeds and charred wood, things like that. So there's evidence for some of the paleobotanical stuff. Architecture, we actually found some stone-layered floors. And then works in the size bone, which I'll show you some. And those are all pin, antler flakers, things like that. But 399, the Vineyard Valley mobile home site, had the largest diversity of materials. Next. So here's some of the stone floors or pavements that we found. Sometimes, like in Northern California, I've seen houses or semi-subterranean. You may have like a little shelf or a bench, a little rock bench. These, we couldn't trace them out. We couldn't find if they were part of a house or not. But we picked up a couple of these. A lot of these have artifacts, stone artifacts in them. So like you can see right here, that's a bowl mortar. Hand stones, which were used for grinding small seeds and things like that. And then when you're retrenching, you can actually see them in the sidewall. This sidewall is particularly interesting because you get this dark soil here, which has a lot of ash, charcoal, and funnel material in it. So you get a rock layer here, but then when you get down into the alluvial deposit of the old river flow, there's a rock layer there too. And that rock layer may have been deposited, not culturally, but by the fluvial deposits of the river. Next slide. So we found ash lenses, a big fire hearth right here, another one up there, and then in this sidewall you can see we picked one up right here. We've done some of the flotation on it, but instead of focusing on some of the botanical stuff, we decided to focus on many of the lithics and the burials and some of the more common stuff for the analysis. Sometimes you just get so much stuff that you have to choose. Next slide. So here, this is what's a piece of brownstone. Some call it a matadi. It's a flat grinding stone. And there's another one that we found coming out of the sidewall. Next slide. Here you have a series of bedrock mortars right here, pestle right here, and another pestle right there, and that's just a close thing. The pestle they had flaked here, and it was flat on one side, and then rounded on the other side. Next slide. Yeah, here's one of our big grinding stones right here that was underneath of this rock feature right there. Next slide. You guys sick of rock features yet? All right, we're sick of rock features. All right, next slide. All right, so brownstone. I've been talking about brownstone, so here's a few slides of brownstone. So, but anyway, so these are mortars right here. There's probably a small pestle there that has been worn. Next slide. Beautiful pestle right here. Yeah, mortar right here. Okay, we know that. Anyway, that's called a chartstone. We're very scientific, so we know it is probably used for different purposes. But it's called a chartstone, that's what we think they are. A lot of people think that they may have had, you find some with asphaltum on the top, and they may have been charms to hang over fishing holes or things like that. There's ethnographic accounts of using them. We found quite a few of those. Next slide. Yeah, we did find a fair amount of bone tools, bone and shell tools. This right here is just a blow up of that right here. This, you see this coming up in what we call military sites, the Bay Area. It's called a sweat scraper. It's serrated on one edge right here. And then up here we have antler, flakers, some other bone needle up there, and then the olive shell up there. Next slide. And then we found unmoored bone. So we actually brought the Grizzly Bear humerus with us tonight, so it's up here if you guys want to see it. That was a big find. But the kinds of bone that we found eagle, and we weren't sure if it was golden, and there's another kind of. But anyway, hawk, duck and geese is really common, heron and crow. For the larger mammals, elk, deer, and antelope. For the carnivores, we had coyote, grizzly bear, gray fox. For the smaller mammals, rabbit, mouse, squirrel, mole, ground squirrel. And then we found turtle, salmon, and carpons. And then over on the left and below, you have a deer humerus there with cut marks where they were probably cracked it to get the marrow out of the inside of the bone. Next slide. So, the most represented species was deer. 31% of the sample of 9,148 items, which is a heck of a lot, was burnt. And then the 72 fragments have cut marks. We thought there'd probably be a higher percentage, but there just wasn't. But looking at the slides, you have elk and deer antler. One of the bigger ones was used for flaking, for knocking off pieces of rock from another rock. We have deer metapodials that can be shaped into awls or needles quite easily. And then we had a turtle shell and a humerus. Next slide. So here are some of the work bone pieces. We have a bone pin, pendant, very finely ground down. We have an antler awl tip. Next slide. And here we have an assortment of, this is a bird bone whistle, and we weren't able to speciate it. County, I know of a couple in Yosemite where they buried these obsidian tools in kind of like packages that were probably bound and wrapped. As we were excavating, we found in one of the units this feature which looked like this ball of obsidian. And that's a close-up of it when we cleaned around it. And you can see there's a lot of flakes, kind of all cemented together. Next slide. Oh, well, don't worry, I'll show you something what it is. All right, but just to show you the numbers, these are the totals of flaked stone artifacts. So, just to go through a few terms, we're scientists, right? So projectile points. How do you explain a projectile? Just say arrowhead, okay? These are basically small little arrowheads that people see. Bifaces, that's another scientific term. Two, it means an artifact that's been worked on each side, because there's two faces to a biface. Uniface, can someone tell me? Yeah, there you go. All right. Need a job? There you go. So anyway, and then drills, they're usually pointed. So, and then edge-modified flakes, they're usually just a flake that's been modified a little bit on one side, but there are what they call flake scars. And then tools, cobbles. Debitage is the residue of the flaking debris. So at Napa 399, we found 285,990 pieces of debitage just in the control units. That wasn't, what was taken away or what we didn't pick up as we were monitoring. So, it's just an immense collection. The debitage is good because it can tell you how things are made. And the debitage should correlate to some of these artifacts up here in terms of their production. Next slide. So, just to give you the different features that we found that had the densities. So per cubic meter, some of them we were getting like 30,000, 40,000, 20,000 flakes per cubic meter. So you think of a cubic meter as a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot thing, and you have someone sitting there all day pulling out one flake at a time. We actually went to a little bit faster method. We were washing everything and then putting in the buckets and taking it back to the lab because it was just taking too long because there was so much. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about how to date. How are we going to date these thousands of pieces of debitage, the bifaces, the projectile points that we have? Well, there's a process called the obsidian hydration process. It's only peculiar to obsidian. It doesn't work with some of the Franciscan cherts or other types of rocks, the basalts that you get around here. So you have an artifact. Oh, it's an arrowhead. And what you do is you make two parallel cuts on the artifact with a geologic saw. And then you grind it and smooth it down. And then you're able to read what's essentially a water layer on that artifact. So the premise is when that flake or that artifact is made, the last bare surface will start accumulating water at a constant rate. Now there's all kinds of complications, but on a relative basis, it works. So we did a lot of obsidian hydration analysis on the stuff here. Next slide. So if we look at the dating, and we can relate it to a calendar date. So you see a peak right here, and that's probably about, we measure it in microns. So that's about 2.5 microns, which translates to say roughly 1,000 years. You see another peak over here at about the 4.8 micron range, and that translates to about, say, 3,000 years. And this is all BP. So you can see we actually got a wide range of dates from the site. When we first started doing the analysis, this kind of perplexed us, because we thought, well, we've got late period stuff. We didn't get stuff that's old when we tested. But our initial dating showed that it was occupied over a long period of time. And that's essentially what this graph tells you. Next slide. However, when we look at the artifact types, so this is it's an Augustine, we're going to talk about the Augustine pattern. It's also called a Stockton serrate, and it's a small little arrowhead. And it's got little nice serrations on the edge. And if we look at the rim readings for this artifact, they all come in between 2 and, say, 2.4. Going to the far left, you have these large bifaces, which are worked on both sides. And when we hydrated those, those kind of coincided with the peak, about 4.5. So we were able to tease out the different artifact types by the hydration, and that was on a broad scale. Next slide. So, what did we find out about the site? The production of obsidian bifaces for use, for trade. The bifaces were made from obsidian cobbles and flakes, probably roughed out at the quarry, then moved down here for additional working. Primarily during the Upper Archaic period, that's when a lot of the manufacture was going on. And then it switched to arrowhead manufacture from cores around AD 900 to 1500. The flake stone densities varied across the deposit, so we were able to pinpoint areas where we thought were local to that site manufacturing areas. The western side, half the site, had a higher density of flake stone artifacts per cubic meter. And there was no discrete patterns in the flake stone artifact associations with burial. So sometimes some of the burial offerings will be like white chert or things like that, but they were all obsidian artifacts. Next slide. Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide. Sorry, guys. But you want to see this one. We got the St. Helena for you. Oh, yeah, okay, that's a good one. All right, so in terms of the obsidian features, we had 17 obsidian features. 2 likely represent discrete flake caches for creating tools. The remaining features are discrete reduction loci, where they're just knocking off the flakes to get them ready, workshops or dump areas, and site maintenance disposal areas. If you ever throw a bunch of obsidian flakes on your carpet and walk around, you'll want to know why you want to clean up after yourselves. It's, in fact, when I was a young lad, my mother rented a house to us for a project in Santa Cruz. We were flint-knapping the living room on a shag rug. We blew out the vacuum cleaner, and she would never rent to Archaeologists again in her life. So the earlier features were like middle to late stage reduction in finishing areas, but the later features, the later obsidian features, showed that they were probably more, and it's because of the size, the debitage, and the kind, that they were for arrowhead manufacture. Next slide. So here's another feature, and I showed this one already, and this is what it looked like when we first found this one feature, feature 3. Next slide. So, remember I said how we switched to washing? This is what the feature looked like once we washed all the dirt off it. There's thousands of flakes and bifaces in that deposit there. The St. Helena 41. We were trying to distinguish the features. Well, we hit this feature that had 41 bifaces. So it kind of got named when we started talking about St. Helena 41. So it was 41 large obsidian bifaces. All but 3 are complete. They all date to around 2500 DP. And it gives us a glimpse into... Oh, God, I got so excited about this. So it kind of gives us a glimpse into the manufacturing techniques at the beginning of the Upper Archaic. 2500 BP or 500 BC. Many of them are leaf-shaped. They may have served as preforms for a certain projection point height or biface height. There's a thing called cortex, which we'll see in a minute. Well, let's just go to that slide. Okay, that's the St. Helena 41. The scale is down here, that's 12.5 centimeters. But you can see this white stuff on a lot of these is all what we call cortex. That's the original stone surface. The black shiny is where they knock off flakes to manufacture that particular type of tool. And then you can see on most of the chips, they've left them, they haven't made a fine point. They've left them a little bit of cortex on it so that they can, and it's easier to transport that way. So that was one of the best. And when we did the hydration dating, we didn't believe it. They all dated the same downward. So then we send another sweep for another set of dates out, and it's phenomenal, something like this. Next slide. So we looked at how it changed over time, and it looked like the leaf-shaped types during the Upper Archaic, and those bifaces were probably preforms with that leaf shape. And then in the later Augustine period, coming up from 900 AD or so, you get the smaller quartz. You get a lot of cortex, which means that they were probably doing primary reduction of the stuff that they got from Napa Mountain at the site. And more bifaces have that inner cortex below the Augustine, which could reflect changes in trade and exchange in California. There's been several theories on why are they leaving these little things. Are they Italians as a signature of the maker? But we believe it's more of a technological advantage for transport, because your tip, when it's real smooth, is glass. It's going to break off. If it's, ever have a couple bottles roll around the back of your car? So you get a few flake stars, talking about. Anyway, so this is like our summary. The small ones that I showed you, these are the Stocktons, and they dated from 800 to 200, 1500 to 300 BP. Then the leaf shape, big wide range, concave base. We did get a few stemmed and unknowns, but the majority of these were in that 4000 to 1500 BP range. Next slide. Next slide. So anyway, this is just to show you some of the projectile point types. The top, the thing called the rattlesnake, and these are arranged chronologically by time. These are the Augustine or Stockton serrates. These are the leaf-shaped Excelsiors, probably manufactured from the St. Helena 41 collection, and then some other things. And this is on the timeline, so later in time you get the small arrow points, which coincides with the introduction of the bow and arrow to California, and then the bigger stuff is over here. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hager.
It's pretty old, though.
Burials at the site. There were 162 people there. 161 of them were prehistoric. And when we say prehistoric, we're talking about them being native Californians, and they were dated, all these burials were dated between 2450 and 1950 years BP, BP referring to before present. So we use that terminology, so you just go back 2,000 years or more and figure that out. And then one burial was a historic period burial that dated at 150 years BP. So that woman was put at the site much, much later than the other burials. So she was treated separately from the prehistoric ones. The people buried at the one side that had the burials, Napa 399, I'll refer to it as 399, they were men and women and adults and juveniles. They were, this slide here, one of the things that we do is we look at the bones, and by looking at the bones such as the lower bones, and looking at the muscle marks on the bones, we could tell that these people were very strong, very robust, and very physically active. Even the ones that were suffering from chronic infections and other things of ill health, they were out there on the landscape, actively involved in their daily activities. I'll talk about some of the various health issues that were revealed in the analysis in a different slide, but just here to show you that some of the bones that we look at, a skull, the back of the skull, and then some teeth down here. We look at all of the bones very, very much in detail, looking at every surface and seeing if we can find out what is going on. This slide here in the middle, hopefully you can see, was a young male, an adolescent, that was found with a projectile point embedded in his hip bone. This particular one, we've talked about it in We know that it killed him because, first of all, it's still embedded, and second of all, there was no bony growth around that biface, so we know that it killed him. 2 women died in childbirth. We could see when we excavated them that they did have their fetus in the pelvis and that they clearly died in childbirth. Very, very surprisingly, I've never seen this in my 35 years experience here in native California. We found one young male whose lower legs, and that would be the very lower part of the legs, had been amputated or severed. Not necessarily purposely, maybe it was an accident. And then, very surprisingly, he did not die. He survived for several years, and we know that because of the growth of the bone, the remodeling of the bone, that only occurs if the person has been. So that shows this caring and intense caring of people, even if they were ill, sick, or not able to get around on their legs. I've got a couple of pictures here and over on your left. Some individuals, but not all, were buried with things. With beads, for example, with quartz crystals, something up here that we call Lake County diamonds. You might have heard of them. We find one individual with over 100 of them in association with that individual. Some people had beads of shell and bones, stone tools, obsidian bifaces, and those chartstones that John talked about earlier. Some people didn't have anything with them. There was variation in that. Some with, some without. Next. One of the things that we do as a bioarchaeologist or physical anthropologist is figure out the age at death. How old is the person when they die? So we did that with the 162 burials. We figured out how old they were when they died. And what we see is that we have many more adults than juveniles. Juveniles being from the neonate up to the adolescent, age 16, 18, something like that. 20 would be putting it into the adult stage. We find a lot more adults. Now, we're not really sure why that is. It could be a sampling error. There may still be some juveniles there. It could also mean that that particular area, that particular space, was more reserved for adult individuals that had died than the juveniles. In most samples, you find a better, like juveniles at half of the adults, but this one is very much adults. In particular, this actually should be reading, so it should say 30 to 49. That shouldn't say 30 to 40, it's 30 to 49. What we call middle adults. We find that more individuals in the sample were aged between 30 to 49 years than the young adults, which are aged between 20 and 29, or the older adults, which is 50 plus. So we have a lot of people in that middle sample there. And one of the things this is showing is the survivorship of these people. You know, I've been asked many times, people hear that the lifespan of native peoples was 30. That's not true. We know that's not true. We have lots and lots of evidence of people living into their 30s and 40s, people living into their 50s, and even people into their 60s and maybe older. So that does happen. It's not as many. Here we have this the dispersal of these. We have older adults, but maybe not as many. So they're surviving, and they're surviving certainly into that middle age group. I put these things up here, these charts, just to let you know that we use standard aging criteria to age these people at death, including looking at the teeth, looking at the growth of the long bones, and then as they get older, which is unfortunate, I hate to tell you, but we start to look at the degeneration of the bone after about 30. So after about 30, we're really looking at how the bone is being impaired or degenerating with age. Next. The other thing that we want to do is we want to figure out which ones are males and which ones are females. And at this particular end, as I put it here, we use two main areas of the body. The best area of the body, of course, is the hip bones, the pelvis, because that's where we see the differentiation between males and females due to the demands of childbirth. So we see real differences in the hip bone, and whenever we have the hip bone, that's our primary sexing criteria. But sometimes we don't have it, and sometimes we want to corroborate what we have by looking at the skull. So we used characters on the skull to determine if it was a male or a female. At this site, we got many more females than males. So we have a lot of females, we have a lot of middle adult females, and we have more than the male. And I put up here a couple of possible reasons. One is something that we see in modern people today, and that is that the survivorship of males is not as great as the survivorship of females. More women live longer than men, that's a possible thing. The other possibility is that there are more males of this community, more of them are buried off-site somewhere else. So more females at this site than males. Next slide. All of the prehistoric burials, and even the historic one actually, were in the same position, and that is the flexed or crouched position. I have a schematic down there of what it looks like, but it's the fetal position, where everything is like that. Very small grave overall, and it's a very typical burial pattern for prehistoric people around the world. It's very, very common. Some of them were very giant. As you can see in this one, you can't even see the legs because the legs are completely underneath the torso. Some were more loosely flexed, so they might be like this, or maybe a little bit farther up. So we have a little bit of variation, but they were all flexed. Most were on their right side or their left side. Some were on their back, some were on their stomach, and we had one that was in a sitting position. The orientation, when we're excavating a burial, after we excavate it, we're doing our documentation of it, we look at the position, determine its position, and make sure we know what's going on, but then we also look to see how it is oriented. And orientation is determined by looking to see what, the direction the head is pointing. So we would, for example, take a line between the head running down the main axis of the body and determine which way they had placed that body into the grave. It was not a random event. When a grave was dug, the position they wanted, they had a particular position they wanted and a particular direction. At this site, the individuals are almost totally in the western direction. The heads are pointing to the west. They're pointing to the mainly due west, then southwest and northwest, and given the variation through the different seasons, that westerly orientation is clearly a non-random pattern at this site. Next. This is just a general summary of some of the pathologies and anomalies that we saw on the people from 399. This top picture here is a cranial or skull bone looking through a cross section. That is, that one is fragmented. We pulled it up and looked to see how it looks in by the cross section there, looking through a part of it. And when it's really big like that, it's a sign of anemia. A number of our individuals from 399 had anemia. Now, anemia is caused by different things. Mostly, for us, we think immediately iron deficiency because that's the most common one for us. But you can also be anemic through vitamin deficiency, particularly vitamin B12, folic acid, vitamin A, vitamin C helps you absorb iron. So if you're deficient in either of these things, they will show up on the skull or other parts of the body and tell us that that person was in fact anemic. In this particular example, at this site, it looks like the deficiency was primarily in vitamin B12 and folic acid. So that's where we're actually looking. There are two factors. One is low intake of this vitamin. The other is not being able to absorb it. And so those are the two factors that we're looking at as to why they are not getting enough of those vitamins. I've also put a couple of pictures to show that many people had poor dental health. Their teeth were worn. There were abscesses, and you see in this one, this is showing you some of the dental wear. And there were dental caries or cavities. Dental caries and cavities are not always seen in these native California samples, but in this particular one we definitely saw it, and it probably is related to the carbohydrates in the acorns that they're eating. We had chronic infections. 37 individuals had mild to severe infections, chronic, living with an infection. This is pre-antibiotics. There's none of that going, so if you get an infection or a cut, which might seem very simple to us, could lead to an ongoing infection. 10 individuals had a very serious bone infection called osteomyelitis. And that slide there showed it. Did you hit something?
No, it's just,
Oh, yeah, I did something.
it went on standby.
Okay. It's control 8. See if you can get it. So they have this disease called osteomyelitis, and it is a very serious bone infection. And one of the things that was most amazing about seeing this is that these people lived with it. They lived with it for many years, some of them, because you can see the way the bone is remodeling and the way that they've actually had it for some time. So, and yet they continued to live, and I pray we admire their survivorship. Here, let me see that time. Push it. Point it.
Well, I gotta get it on first.
No, that's not.
Oh, is this plugged in?
Are you kidding? Sam, it's the battery to the computer. You have it? The plug-in?
Oh, a little orange light.
There were a few. Were not intact, and mainly the reason for that is not human disturbance, but by the pressuring of the weight of the site on it. So we got a lot of breakage from the way that because it was quite a ways down, some of these. So it was the compression factor or post-depositional thing that had it. The other thing was during the discovery of them, they sometimes were hit and broke when we were actually discovering them. But they were intact. There were I'd say about 4 or 5, I'm thinking, that actually did look as if they had been disturbed by native peoples who may have been trying to dig a grave and run into somebody else. And we have about 4 or 5 of those to do that. Yeah, yes?
Is this indication of entirely hunter-gatherers, or is this some indication of agriculture?
There's no agriculture, but it is a hunter-gatherer forager society, and when we say that, we tend to think that that means they can free range wherever they want. But that's actually not quite how it is. We think of them as semi-sedentary within a hunting, gathering, foraging kind of environment. So they knew where to go, and they had a home range, and they could go from there, but there was no agriculture. There was no actual formal agriculture. Yeah?
Can you tell how deep the graves were originally from the surface, and how were they done?
That's a really good question. I'm really into the graves. Always was trying to figure out what the grave cut was. We couldn't always tell because we didn't always know where the beginning surface was. But typically, what we would find is that the grave was something like that. It was something like that, like 20, 30 centimeters.
It's hard to see in the dark.
It was about 20 to 30 centimeters is what the typical grave would be. So it looked like it was about 10 centimeters above the body and the body down at the base of it. So we would get a little bit before of grave fill above the body. We would hit the body, and then after the body was gone, there would be just a little bit more of the grave underneath that. Now, I said that they were burying them in a fetal position and digging the grave as if all the graves were exactly as they should be. Sometimes we found, and I don't actually know how they dug the grave, but they were probably digging it with their stone tools hafted onto something, wooden tools, actually digging it. I was going to say, yeah.
Do you know how to file? I got it up on the computer, but I don't know how to.
You need to stand away from it.
Okay, now it says, there was a thing that said, do you want to perform an auto keystone correction?
Of course. Who wouldn't?
Question?
Okay, let me just finish with one about the grave. One of the things about the graves, one of the things that I found was very, very interesting, is that sometimes the graves were quite a bit larger than the skeleton, and sometimes it looked as if they pushed the skeleton into the grave. So we think that they would, dig and it would be all good, but sometimes they dug the grave and thought, it'll fit, I just know it will. There was a question before I started going. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, I don't think I put the picture in. In some of the graves, we think they actually either lined the grave with red ochre or they put red ochre on the top of them, because we found a small portion, but some of them with the red ochre staining on the bone. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Can you speak to the position of the graves in relation to each other, and if they were separate from hearth areas?
Okay. The question is the relationship of the graves to each other. One of the things that we have up here that would be really nice to look is that we have this map, and it's the site distribution of them. And what we see is that some of the graves, individuals were actually clustered quite close to each other. And then some of them would be farther apart. Some of them would be so close together you would think that they might have been buried at the same time, but there was enough discrete grave that they probably weren't. But some of them were clustered, some were not. Yeah.
Did you bury
the bones?
Yes, we did rebury the bones. The question is the reburial of the bones, and we did rebury those. They're all back in the ground. All right, so I should continue, and then I'll come back to questions. John, is that right? No. Go ahead.
Do we know where the red ochre came from?
I actually don't. John, do you know where the red ochre? I don't actually know that offhand myself. For the red ochre, do you understand where it comes from?
There are various mineral sources around the Bay Area. One of the big ones is down in the South Bay. There are also red ochre mineral sources in over north of Lake Berryessa a little bit.
That's fine, John.
Yeah, I'm not sure where
You just had it.
no, that was just your burial one.
Oh. Well, that's the best one, so we can continue on that.
I wanted to do that one.
While you figure out. Go down to that one, the next one. No. Yeah, this. There you go. There you go. Okay, next. Okay. Back. Back. Very good at that. You're fired! You see what everybody else do it. You know, not good. I just want to show you before we leave this one picture. Degenerative joint disease is sometimes called osteoarthritis. It's different than rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease. Osteoarthritis is due to the mechanical stress that we put our bodies through every single day by walking upright, by carrying things and doing all sorts of things. For our backs, for example. This is a series of the neck vertebrae right here. And all of this is the bony lipping that accompanies osteoarthritis. Most individuals from 30 on in native California samples show some sort of osteoarthritis. So some of it is due to that mechanical stress we put our bodies through. And the other that we find a lot is that if you break your bone, at the site of the break, degenerative joint diseases, extra bony growth occurs quite frequently. Next. What we also got is we had several individuals who had healed fractures. That is, they broke their bones, they healed, and they lived. Now, sometimes they did a pretty good job of setting it. So, on something, this is the wrist. In fact, most of these are the wrist. This is the wrist. This big callus there is the remnant of a broken bone. So it broke, it healed, but this person would have had a nice little jutting thing coming out of their arm. This particular one is the ulna, the arm again, and this is how it healed. So these two bones come apart. They never really formed the proper bony callus, and this individual then had this very, very odd sort of arm, lower wrist. This is a foot bone. We find that more females than males had a wrist fracture that is very common. It's called a Cole's fracture, and that occurs when you're about to fall and you go back like this, you brace it, and as you brace it, this breaks. Many more women than men at this site had that kind of break, and on the other hand, most of the osteoarthritis in the foot were found in males. So we get what we did is we spread it out, we looked to see where males and females were, and we can say something about the lifestyle of males and females by doing this kind of thing. You can see that males and females both have an equal amount of fractures, but the fractures themselves are different. One individual had 3 fractured bones, one in the rib, one on the foot, and another, I think, in the arm. So, very interesting. Next slide. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is something that not a lot of individuals have, but it's a very interesting thing that we find in these native Californians. This picture here, this is the side of an individual's head. This is the ear canal. Okay, so that's the ear. So it's really looking just like this part of the head. And when you look at this looks like bone in there, doesn't it? In fact, that is exactly what it is. So we found more males than females. Only one female had a very slight bit of this. The ear bone had grown through. And what this is that it's what we would today call swimmer's ear. And that's where their bony growth prevents cold water from going down into the ear canal. The body's protecting itself, so it builds up the bone, prevent that from happening. And as it builds up, it starts to look like this, and serious hearing impairment follows. And again, we see a real difference between males and females. More males doing this, probably more males doing that cold water diving than females. Okay, I think that's it. Let's finish it out and then we can ask questions later.
Well, hi, I'm Sim. I'm just going to make some quick points about the dating that we did for the St. Helena project, and just to really carry home the point that we really are dealing with between 2,000 and 3,000 years of history here in St. Helena. And one of the big research goals, kind of tying this back to what we started off with John, talking about the different research questions that we had, was really discussing when did this site date to? And to do so, we have a number, we had sort of the privilege of working in the present day, we have a number of different methodologies that we can use to date the site. Key among them is radiocarbon dating. A lot of you know about radiocarbon dating, so I won't go into too much detail about that, but it's changed in the last 50 years. So you can take smaller samples and you can really get, narrow down your period of time or period of occupation in the order of about 30 years or so, margin of error. John talked about obsidian hydration dating. I won't go too much into that, but that's another tool that archaeologists can use to really identify when a site was used. And then third, as you've seen on the screen behind us, a lot of the artifacts here on the table 2, are time sensitive. They're diagnostic to particular times of the past 2,000 years of history. So olivella beads, projectile point types, these are all things that archaeologists can use to really nail down a chronology for a site. The second, within this research goal of dating the site, the second big point here to make is that we want to refine the established chronology for Napa Valley. Archaeologists have been running around Napa Valley since the 1940s, so this is a good opportunity to link our data up with the existing collections that are out there. And then third down there is basically to establish the vertical and horizontal control for the site. What that means basically is to get a really good sense of what's happening spatially across a site as well as vertically, what's happening from the ground down. Next slide. In order to carry out our radiocarbon dating, our obsidian hydration dating, we have a number of parameters that we want to speak to. First and foremost, we wanted to get permission from the WAPO community to conduct this destructive dating. This was not a casual decision by any means, and I just want to carry that point home today. It's a destructive method, and we got permission, thankfully, from the WAPO community to do this work and to understand the site and this community that lived there. Second, we really wanted to select radiocarbon dates from the top, bottom, and sides of this archaeological site. As you can see on the map here behind us, and on the next slide, this is basically the digital version of this map. You can see we have each of these little freckles on this map are burials, and this gives you the sense of the size of the site. This is a bird's eye view. If you flipped it and you're looking at it in profile, like a layer cake, here's the trees on the ground surface. This is what's happening below the surface. So what we want to do is get radiocarbon dates from this end all the way over here, and then also from the top down to the bottom. And then the next slide. Another parameter is we wanted to collect the smallest bone sample still likely to produce datable collagen. And this kind of ties back into the first point that this is a destructive method. We're respecting the people that lived here and the present-day community who affiliate with these remains. Next point is that the burials that we were dating from, we wanted to make sure that they had associated obsidian artifacts. That way we could submit matched pairs to corroborate our data. So what we're getting from the AMS data, from the AMS dates, does that tie into the obsidian hydration determinations as well? So in the end, we submitted 26 samples. Some of the collagen wasn't datable. Ultimately, we got 22 dates returned from 21 burials and 1 bone artifact. So next slide. This is the spread. So if you took all of your radiocarbon dates and you plotted them in a program, this is how they would all lie. And basically, this is a statistical way of looking at the most likely period of time when these individuals lived. One thing to point out, John, the next slide. There's burial 32. All right, this is the individual that Lori discussed had 261 glass trade beads associated with this individual. Their burial 32 is sitting there 150 years BP. And this more or less corresponds to a period of time of Spanish missionization in the San Francisco Bay Area. 1776, you have Mission San Francisco established over on the San Francisco Peninsula. You have burial 32 over here. What this means is not entirely clear, The glass beads sort of overlap in sort of the Spanish period into the Mexican period, so that there's a little bit of leeway there. The date gives us more or less a good approximation for when this individual lived. And then John, the next slide. So there's burial 32, just to give you a sense for where this person was interred relative to the rest of the community. Next slide. Just to really drive home this. These are the glass beads. So we have some white on white glass beads, some opaque white beads, and polychrome beads associated with the individual. The main sort of, the bulk of the population, I believe, basically falls within this 500-year window from 500 BC to approximately 0 AD. And this is a really good visual to give you a sense for the permanence and the attachment that these people had to this particular spot. This is an important place where people were burying their dead, right? And just to carry on the point again, this is 1900 BP to 2450 BP, or approximately 500 BC to about 0 BP, zero. Next slide. And this is all corroborated with other lines of evidence that we've already talked about in this presentation. Here is just to sort of talk about some of the olivella beads that are diagnostic of this period of time. Different bead types are distinctive to certain time periods. These are beads that are cut from the wall of the olive snail, perforated and then strung. Next slide. And then sort of tying back to what John was discussing a little earlier about the obsidian hydration dating, we essentially have a date range from about 2800 BP to 656 BP using the obsidian hydration method. So if you go to the next slide, here's the spread again, and I guess the next slide also. So you've seen this before, but just to sort of tie it in with the burials, most of the burials sort of fall to the left of this peak here. So it's an interesting pattern, and it sort of speaks to the activities that were already unfolding at this particular spot prior to this big interment. So next slide. Just to kind of sum it up, some of the, in addition to all the wonderful finds that we talked about, the data that Lori presented and the important information that John presented, just to carry on the points here, historic Wapo are demonstrated here with the glass tree beads, burial 32, dating to about 770 AD to 1830. An underlying component to this historical burial is a community that's primarily involved in projectile point manufacture. You see that in the small arrowheads, the serrated arrowheads that John talked about, these stocked-in points, and they are pretty much on site from about 900 to 1500. And then the bulk of this assemblage can be attributed to this middle period, or this Berkeley pattern, and things like charmstones, the large obsidian bifaces, olivella beads, some of the bone tools that we have on display here, and a lot of the groundstone, mortars and pestles. These are all attributed to this middle period, or approximately 500 BC to 8900. And lo and behold, this is where a lot of the burials that we dated fall within this time period, this 500-year window. So next slide. On behalf of John and Lori and myself, thank you very much. We have some artifacts for display up here. You're welcome to come and look at them. We also are happy to entertain questions if you have any.
Turn on the lights.
Yeah, lights.
Do we have the lights? Did everybody turn on their flashlights?
Yay.
All right. Questions?
Yeah, well, thanks. I know some of you guys are getting sorry a little long, but is there any questions?
John?
Oh.
Did you get the impression that this little area you studied was part of a larger settlement?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the question was, do we get the sense that this site was part of a larger settlement? With that, early on in the thing I showed that there was different sites at the same time period as the 399 site. But the activity, like 406, 413, they were the same time periods, but they didn't have the same kinds of artifacts. So there's probably little outlying activity areas in addition to that site. I sense that 399 is not the only site in the Napa Valley at that age. Is that if there was more discovered like that, we'd find more. And it kind of fits with the ethnographic pattern of, villages, a little outlier, and then the Bay Area, it's more along stream channels. So you get 4 or 5 different villages in the same time period, and then they move away for whatever reasons, flooding, or maybe it gets too dirty, or whatever. And then, so there's a sets of sites. It's not just one site.
What are the known trade routes? You say the Indians bringing shells over from the coast, the Obsidian making its way over there, up into the Sierra. Do you know pretty much what this traffic pattern was?
He got it. He nailed it. He asked me what the trade patterns were. So coming into the site, you guys can help me out here a little bit. We have coastal shells coming in, being manufactured into artifacts. I would be surprised. Don't you? I think that we didn't get the kinds of shell that would indicate that they were manufacturing the beads on site. So they were probably coming in whole. And then the Napa glass obsidian actually gets to the coast in terms of exotic items. Napa glass obsidian, as I said earlier, goes all the way down to Monterey and into Central Valley. The bifaces here are a little bit peculiar. That's one thing that why we can't finish the darn report is that, wow, let's start looking at flaking patterns. In the Bay Area, you see kind of 2 flaking patterns on the Napa glass mountain artifacts. One I call the knives, forks, and spoons, where it's not as finely flaked, it's kind of expedient tools, but like the St. Helena 41, they're very finely flaked, and they're pattern flaking. Those you usually find associated with grade goods during the middle period. So these may have been blanks that were being, they're obviously, I think they're being traded somewhere. And you also get up in the upper Central Valley, you get Napa Obsidian. But in the, like say the Cape Valley, you get Borax Slate, you get Napa Valley, but then you also get eastern, like Monoglass Mountain or eastern Sierra Obsidians. So somewhere in that Central Valley area, by the kinds of obsidians that you find in sites, you can deduct that, hey, obsidian from Napa Glass Mountain doesn't go past Stockton. All of a sudden we start getting a lot of bony hills. So did I answer your question? Okay.
This site at one time had been a traditional mountain site, but over the years it eroded away, and over in Polk Valley, we have a number of mountain sites with artifacts in them, but there's no Napa River washing no flooding, they're basically as they were for the last 500,000.
I suspect it probably was a mountain site. Early, in the 40s, it was actually, in fact, I met the son of the owner, it's a truck farm. A lot of tomatoes and things like that. Then they came in, agriculture, viticulture didn't come in until late, and there was a lot of wheat grown here in the valley. So viticulture didn't come in until late. With viticulture, it was more of the flattening of the mounds and pushing stuff aside. I think part of the site got lopped off. And then when, not as much as close to the riverbank, because there was still the natural slope when they pulled the riprap off the bank. But my guess it was a mound. It may not have been as high because they had to put 3 feet of fill on it in order to grade the pad for the mobile home park there.
So as an adjunct to that, are you able to determine where the river's course was during this time period where we're looking at it? So the river has tended to move over a period. And the river may have been at that time, or anything worse than that?
The river, at one stratigraphic profile that we saw, was probably about 15 feet more towards St. Helena. And it was a wider channel. And that was based on river gravels that we had seen in our profile that were down about 8 feet. So the river channel obviously had moved.